norma lateralis? What about the norma basalis? What about the norma basalis externa? For descriptive purposes, and because of the norma basalis externa is an irregular bony mass, so that we can easily divide the norma basalis externa by two imaginary lines. The first imaginary line is the line that forms the posterior boundary of this large structure, which is known as bony palate. And the second imaginary line is the line that pass tangential to the anterior margin of this foramen, which is the foramen magnum. By these two lines, we will divide the norma basalis externa into three regions: anterior region, middle region, and the posterior region. The anterior region, which is actually the anatomy of the bony palate. So the bony palate is formed of four bones. So these four bones are separated from each other by crochet suture. So this suture is known as intermaxillary suture. This means that we have an intermaxillary suture in the norma frontalis, and it extends also in the norma basalis externa. Because of that, is to separate these two plates, which are known as palatine processes of the maxilla. Two palatine. So this is the palatine process, and this is another one. These two processes are derived from the two maxillae. And posteriorly, we have also this suture, this one. This suture is known as palato-maxillary suture that separates the two palatine processes of the maxilla from these two small bones, which are known as horizontal plates of the palatine bone. So this is why this suture is known as palato-maxillary suture. And finally, we have this small one, this suture, which is known as interpalatine suture, because it separates the two horizontal plates of the palatine bones. And these are the bones and the sutures forming the hard palate. Then we have this foramina, which is known as the palatine foramen, and these two large foramina, which are the greater palatine foramina, and these small foramina, which are known as lesser palatine foramina. And this is the posterior nasal spine, and the posterior nasal spine lies in the inferior boundary of this large aperture, which is known as posterior nasal aperture. What about the middle part of the norma basalis externa? First, in the middle part of the norma basalis externa, we will be faced by this foramen, which is the posterior nasal aperture. And the posterior nasal aperture is separated into right and left foramina by this midline separate bone, which is known as vomer. And on each side of the greater palatine foramina, we have these two processes on each side, which are known as a sphenoidal process. And the sphenoid process is or sometimes known as pterygoid processes. The pterygoid processes are formed of two plates. This plate, which is known as medial pterygoid plate, and this plate, which is known as lateral pterygoid plate, and the lateral pterygoid plate terminates inferiorly by this small like projection, which is known as pterygoid hamulus. And the space between the two pterygoid plates are known as pterygoid fossa. And then we have on each side multiple foramina, and I will postpone the multiple foramina till the explanation of the Norma basalis interna, inshallah. Then lateral to these multiple foramina, we have here, this is the mandibular fossa, right and left, for articulation with the head of the mandible, like this. So this is the head of the mandible, and the head of the mandible will articulate with the mandibular fossa. And as I mentioned before, this is known as mandibular tubercle. This is the mandibular tubercle. And this bone is known as tympanic plate or tympanic part of temporal bone. And this spine-like process, and it is absent here, this is known as a styloid process, which is a part of the temporal bone. And here on each side, this is the mastoid part of temporal bone. Proceeding posteriorly, starting from here, all this bone, this is the occipital bone. This small part of the occipital bone is known as basilar part of the occipital bone. And in its middle, we have a small tubercle, this one, which is known as the pharyngeal tubercle. And these are the two occipital condyles. And the two occipital condyles will articulate with the first cervical vertebra to form atlantoaxial joint. And this foramina is the foramen magnum. As I mentioned before, the majority of the foramina present in the Norma basalis externa communicates with the Norma basalis interna directly, except this foramen. This foramen communicates indirectly with the Norma basalis interna. This foramen, this is in one side, and the same foramen on the opposite side. So this foramen is known as the carotid foramen for the entrance of the internal carotid artery, or through this foramen, the internal carotid artery leaves the neck in order to enter the skull. And inshallah, through the Norma basalis interna, I will explain how this foramen is indirect communication between the interna and the externa. To proceed to the